This is Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Today, we go back to a day that shocked the nation, May 6th, 2013, and ask a harder question. How did it take more than a decade for 3 Cleveland women to be found alive, held inside a house that sat in plain sight? With me is Dr. Lena Ortiz, clinical social worker and researcher who spent years working with survivors of long-term abuse. Lena, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mara. I'm glad we can talk about this carefully. There's a lot wrapped up in that case that feels very close to the issues I work on: trauma, control, and system failures.
So let's start there. I want to open the episode the way the public first understood it: the sound of a door and a scream. Picture this: a front storm door on Seymour Avenue, a woman kicking, a neighbor hearing it, running over. Charles Ramsey later described barbecuing nearby when he heard a woman screaming for help. He helped break out the lower panel of the storm door. Amanda Berry squeezed through with her 6-year-old daughter. And then, behind that door, police found 3 women: Amanda, Gina, and Michelle. It felt impossible. It felt like a different world collapsing into the street. Lena, what do you remember feeling the first time you read those reports?
I remember numbness at first, and then a very professional curiosity that quickly turned into anger. How could so many routine interactions with social services, with neighbors, with the criminal justice system not have ended in a rescue years earlier? At the same time, I was aware of a survivor-centered instinct to avoid re-traumatizing the women by turning their story into spectacle. Those two things, the systemic questions and the human cost, stayed with me.
Exactly. And that tension between public outrage and the need to treat survivors with dignity is one of the guiding instincts of this show. Today, we'll reconstruct the events, but more than that, we'll chase the why. Why did a working-class Cleveland house at 2207 Seymour become invisible? Why did prior contacts with authorities not lead to more probing? And ultimately, what does the case tell us about prevention and accountability? Before we get into timeline details, we should set the stage. Tremont, West Side Cleveland, the kind of neighborhood where people know each other a little but keep to themselves. People borrow tools, kids play in front yards, and at the same time, there's a cultural habit of minding your own business. That paradox, visibility and invisibility at once, matters here.
It matters a lot. From a community health perspective, neighborhoods can develop a kind of habituation to disorder. When broken windows or loud parties are normal, residents lower their threshold for what is urgent. And for people in vulnerable positions, teens, people with unstable housing, people involved with child services, their disappearance can be misclassified as running away or transient behavior. That misclassification is dangerous. It reallocates attention away from people who need it most.
Let's talk briefly about the 3 women, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus, not as headline fodder, but as real lives. Michelle was 21 when she disappeared in August 2002, on her way to a custody hearing for her son. Amanda was 16, disappeared April 21, 2003, after her shift at Burger King. Gina was 14, last seen April 2, 2004, walking home from middle school. All 3 went missing in a relatively small geography on Cleveland's near West Side. Lena, when you hear those ages and contexts, what jumps out clinically?
2 things. 1, youth and dependency make people targets. Teens are more likely to accept rides from familiar adults or older acquaintances. 2, The social lens through which these young women were seen matters. Michelle had prior contact with child welfare and struggled with poverty. Some people assumed she had run. Amanda and Gina got more media coverage, in part because of the family's persistent public advocacy. These are reminders that social status, family advocacy, and even media attention shape the urgency of response.
Right. And part of why this story is still unanswered is because of those disparities. Michelle's case got less attention. That matters. Now, let's look at Ariel Castro, the man who committed these crimes. He lived at 2207 Seymour. He had an earlier history of violence, allegations of domestic abuse toward his former partner, arrests in the 1990s, and yet he was not convicted in a way that removed him as a risk. He also worked as a school bus driver until 2012, where coworkers would later say he'd been fired for rule violations. On the street, neighbors sometimes described him as friendly, playing bass, barbecuing, at other times controlling, volatile. How do you make sense of that duality, Lena?
It's sadly familiar. Perpetrators of long-term abuse often present two faces: the neighborly public face and the abusive, coercive private face. This split serves control. If no one sees the private violence, it becomes easier to maintain activity or abuse. Added to that, histories of childhood abuse in perpetrators, Castro reported very severe early abuse, can be part of a cycle, although that background doesn't excuse the crimes. The clinical challenge is recognizing how these presentations can coexist undetected for long periods, especially when victims have limited avenues for reaching help.
And there were missed chances. The Department of Child and Family Services visited the Seymour house in January 2004 after reports that Castro had left a child on a bus. They knocked, got no answer, and left. They did not force entry, did not escalate. This was probably an opportunity when at least two of the victims were already inside. It's one of the most painful elements. A threshold was crossed and nobody went through it. Lena, in your experience, what are the barriers for agencies to force entry during welfare checks?
Legal constraints are one. Welfare checks often happen under a knock-and-announce policy. Investigators need probable cause to get a warrant unless there's an immediate life threat. But beyond the legal, there are resource and culture issues. Understaffed units, risk-avoidant policies, poor interagency communication. If child welfare shows up and there's no immediate sign of distress, it can be tempting to retreat rather than escalate. The problem is, in situations like Seymour, that benign neglect approach can be catastrophic. That
phrase, benign neglect, is chilling in this context. And it's not just agencies. Neighbors reported odd things over the years: covered windows, loud music, sometimes glimpses of a child, and at least one account of a naked woman on a leash in the backyard. But accounts vary about whether those calls to police were made or how seriously they were taken. There's a social dimension here. People were used to sirens. People often feared retaliation. People had a cultural "don't get involved" rule. How do we reconcile the limits of community responsibility with the need to protect vulnerable people?
We have to center both empathy and realistic expectations. Neighbors are not trained investigators, but community education matters. Recognizing signs of chronic neglect or unusual patterns, boarded windows, people never going outside, children always indoors, should be communicated to authorities with follow-up requests. Also, agencies need to be accountable. If a resident reports serious concerns, There should be a clear path for escalation and feedback. Making community members feel heard is part of prevention.
And the media plays a role, sometimes a distorting one. Michelle Knight's disappearance was often framed as a runaway case, which affected the resources and attention it received. Amanda and Gina had more visible campaigns and vigils. This ties into a broader phenomenon media scholars call missing white woman syndrome, the uneven coverage based on perceived innocence, attractiveness, or demographic fit. Here, Michelle was older, poorer, and entangled with child services. She received less attention. Lena, how does societal bias shape the reality of investigation and recovery?
Bias shapes both resource allocation and public imagination. When authorities and the public see someone as transient or troubled, they may unintentionally deprioritize that person's disappearance. That bias manifests in fewer leads, less investigative energy, and in survivors internalizing a feeling of abandonment. Clinically, that compounds trauma. Many survivors later say the worst wound was not only the abuse, but the sense that the world had written them off.
So we have a house that looked ordinary from the street, a man with a double life, victims who were mischaracterized, and agencies that didn't push hard enough. Inside the house, and I'll be careful here with language, the women were chained, restrained, forced into repeated sexual and physical abuse, moved from a basement to an upstairs room over time, their pregnancies controlled and even violently terminated. Amanda gave birth to a daughter while captive. These are facts without salaciousness. They show the contours of control. Lena, when survivors describe captivity like this, what patterns of control are you hearing?
Coercive control in long-term captivity is designed to demolish autonomy. It's not just physical restraint. It's surveillance, isolation, deprivation of food and hygiene, psychological manipulation, telling victims that no one is looking for them, cutting them off from language and identity, alternating punishment with small gifts to create dependency. These tactics are highly effective in making escape and the will to escape dangerous. And over time, victims may internalize an identity of helplessness, which is why rescue is only the first step. Recovery is a long process.
And the rescue did come. On May 6, 2013. Amanda kicked open part of the storm door and screamed. Charles Ramsey ran over. He helped them out. Amanda called 911. "Help me, I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped for 10 years. Police entered and found Gina and Michelle. Castro was arrested later that day in a McDonald's parking lot. The sequence has this cinematic quality, but I want to emphasize the ordinary courage in those few minutes. A neighbor hearing a scream and acting. A woman deciding to risk that the door was truly open. It matters that rescue required both a choice by Amanda and action from a neighbor. Lena, from a trauma perspective, what does it take for a captive to seize that kind of moment?
It takes an immense psychological recalibration. Years of conditioning tell someone that attempts to escape are punished. Choosing to act often begins with a small shift. Notice of a slightly unsecured door, a change in the captor's routine, a moment of protectiveness for a child, and grows into the courage to try. That's layered on fear of retaliation and doubt about whether anyone will believe you. So when a survivor takes that step, it's an extraordinary act of agency, not desperation alone.
And after the rescue came fast public attention. Castro faced nearly 1,000 charges and ultimately took a plea deal, life without parole plus 1,000 years, avoiding the death penalty. He later died by suicide in prison in September 2013, only weeks into his sentence. That complicated reactions: relief, anger, a sense of incomplete accountability. Lena, how do survivors often respond when perpetrators die early in the process?
It's mixed. Some survivors feel vindicated. They don't want to keep seeing the perpetrator's face in the paper. Others feel robbed of the slow, controlled process of accountability that can sometimes help with closure: testimony, sentencing, a sustained public record. For many, it's not about vengeance. It's about truth and recognition. When a perpetrator dies, those opportunities shrink.
The women themselves, Amanda, Gina, and Michelle, became survivors with agency. They reunited with family, pursued education, wrote memoirs, and engaged in advocacy. Michelle later used the name Lily Rose Lee and spoke about forgiveness and advocacy. Amanda and Gina worked on outreach for missing persons and celebrated delayed graduations. Their resilience is an important counterpoint to the horror. But there are also lasting scars: PTSD, trust issues, and societal expectations that survivors must move on. Lena, what does recovery really look like after years of captivity?
Recovery is nonlinear. You see improvements and setbacks. There's medical care, mental health support, reconnecting with family, and rebuilding a sense of safety. But there are triggers everywhere: a slammed door, a loud voice, media attention. Survivors often need long-term therapy, social support, vocational aid, and sometimes help navigating the spotlight. And importantly, they need choices: to tell their story or to keep it private. Respecting their agency is a crucial part of healing.
That respect is one reason we avoid lurid details here. Our goal is to hold the facts and ask the policy questions. What changes are needed to prevent something like Seymour Avenue from happening again? One obvious answer is better interagency data sharing. Domestic violence history, child welfare contacts, and missing person reports lived in silos. If those pieces had been connected, a different threshold for investigation might have been reached. Lena, beyond data sharing, what structural reforms matter?
Several. First, protocols for welfare checks need revision. Clearer criteria for when to seek warrants or law enforcement assistance. Second, training for first responders and child welfare workers on coercive control signs and how to escalate concerns. Third, community education so neighbors know how to safely report patterns, not just one-off events. Fourth, funding. These measures need money and personnel. Without resources, policies remain aspirations.
And policy alone isn't enough. Bias must be confronted. Who gets the press coverage? Whose disappearance is treated as serious? Michelle Knight's story demonstrates the lethal cost of stereotyping missing people as runaways. Media guidelines could encourage equitable coverage and discourage language that implies blame. Words like troubled or runaway change public perception and investigative energy. Lena, any thoughts about media responsibility?
Media outlets have enormous power to shape urgency. Responsible reporting means centering families, avoiding insinuations of blame, and giving consistent coverage to missing adults, not just to cases that fit a sympathetic stereotype. It also means avoiding psychic or sensationalist narratives that can mislead families, recalling the Sylvia Browne example on national TV, which did real harm.
Yes, the Sylvia Browne moment was tragically illustrative of how pseudoscience can do harm in high-profile missing person cases. Now, as we consider prevention, there's the question of community culture, the bystander effect, fear of retaliation, or deference to privacy. How do we encourage safe intervention without victim blaming or creating vigilante risk?
We focus on systems that take reports seriously and provide a low-bar path for community members to increase oversight. That means hotlines, anonymous tips, guaranteed follow-up calls, and community liaisons who can reassure residents. It also means educating people about small but potentially significant signals. Children never allowed outside, windows always covered, repeated patterns of nighttime arrivals and exits.
Before we move to closing reflections, I want to spend a few minutes on the survivors' narratives. They consistently frame themselves not as broken, but as people rebuilding. Michelle, Lily Rose Lee, spoke about forgiveness and faith. Amanda made public appearances and later hosted segments highlighting missing persons. Gina devoted herself to recovery and family. They all told very public stories while privately dealing with ongoing trauma. Lena, what should listeners understand about the language of victim versus survivor?
Victim describes what happened. Survivor describes what a person is doing now. Both terms have value. Some people prefer one labeled over the other at different times. Importantly, language matters for power. Survivor implies agency and resilience, which can be empowering, but we should avoid demanding that people adopt a particular identity as a moral imperative. The important thing is to let them define themselves and to listen to their needs.
That's an important nuance. Now, I want to be explicit about the ethical commitments of this episode. We will name facts that are in the public record, but we will not linger on graphic detail. We will use silence when the weight of a moment requires it. If you are a survivor listening right now, you are not alone, and we're grateful for your presence.
And a reminder, if anything we discuss brings up personal feelings or trauma, please reach out to local resources, hotlines, community mental health centers, and give yourself permission to step away. There's no obligation to stay with difficult content.
Thank you, Lena. Now, as we draw toward the closing, let's return to the central unsettled questions, the still unanswered parts. 1. How many concrete points of intervention were missed? We can map specific moments. The 1990s domestic violence incidents that didn't lead to sustained consequences, the January 2004 child services visit that didn't escalate, the neighbor's ambiguous reports. 2. How much did bias and class shape attention to this case and similar ones? 3. What structural reforms are realistic in short order? Data sharing, clearer welfare check criteria, funding for child welfare staffing, those are on the list. Lena, if you had to prioritize 3 reforms that would most likely reduce the risk of prolonged captivity like this, what would they be?
Number 1. Mandatory protocols for escalation during welfare checks when there's reasonable suspicion of imminent harm. This could include immediate consultation with law enforcement and an expedited path to a warrant when entry is denied. Number 2, integrated case management systems that link domestic violence histories, child welfare interventions, and missing person reports so patterns trigger red flags. Number 3, sustained funding for trauma-informed training for police, child welfare workers, and community health providers. Training that is refreshed regularly, not a one-off seminar.
Concrete and urgent. I would add a 4th, community accountability mechanisms, ways for residents to report patterns and receive feedback so that reporting doesn't feel like shouting into a void. Before we end, I want to acknowledge a truth that often goes unsaid. While policy fixes are crucial, nothing guarantees that a determined, violent person can't harm others. Some risk remains. The goal is to shrink that risk so significantly that cases like Seymour become extraordinarily unlikely rather than tragically possible.
And to add, Prevention also requires attention to root causes, poverty, untreated mental illness, cycles of abuse that create contexts where perpetrators can operate and victims can become isolated. Addressing those larger social determinants is a moral and practical investment.
We've raced through more than a decade of pain in an hour-ish framework, but the aftermath continues. The women reclaimed their lives the best they could. Families who advocated for them kept vigil for years. Community members were left asking whether they could have done more. Authorities had to confront process failures, and the public had to reckon with how we notice or don't notice people in our neighborhoods. Lena, as we sign off, what should listeners carry with them from this episode?
Carry two things. First, vigilance paired with compassion. If you see concerning patterns, report them and follow up. And second, an awareness that survivors are not statistics. When rescue happens, what follows matters. Support, listening, and respect for autonomy. Those small acts, repeated broadly, change outcomes.
Thank you. Before we go, a brief practical note. This episode used public reporting and court documents. We intentionally avoided sensational detail and centered survivor dignity. If you want to learn more, we'll include a show notes list of resources for survivors and for listeners who want to understand more about coercive control and welfare check protocols. For anyone struggling after hearing this episode, please reach out to your local crisis hotline. If you're in the United States, dialing 988 connects you to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're elsewhere, please find your local services. Lena, thank you for joining me and for grounding this with clinical and policy clarity.
Thank you, Mara. I appreciate the careful approach.
And thanks to you, listener, for spending this time with us. These are difficult stories, but they're worth the attention because on the other side of policy and reform are real people. I'm Mara Ellison. This has been Still Unanswered.